Alrighty. Let me just make sure it works. Things should be working. Awesome. So I'm out of town this week, as you probably see the background change, but um, so I won't be able to share my. I don't have my screen to share, but I thought I would just talk. Maybe this will be a shorter stream this week, but we're gonna kind of talk about the state of the Canadian economy, as you probably saw from the title. Um, One of the major things we've seen over the past 48 hours, we saw the Fed in the U.S. They cut interest rates. Yeah, they cut. I believe they cut interest rates, if I'm not mistaken. But I know that the Canadian government cut interest rates by 25 basis points. That's 0.25%. Um, this is interesting. There's a bit of an interesting dynamic here at play. So, uh, typically speaking, uh, I'll kind of explain the dynamic here, the economics dynamic here, just if you're listening and you're not familiar. But essentially, the way monetary policy works is banks use interest rates as a way, as a tool within their monetary policy framework that they can use to, I guess, control GDP, control inflation. And while it's not perfect, it's a method they use. It's one of their tools they have, along with other things. And I'll get to quantitative easing, actually. I think that's something interesting to point out. But I kind of wanted to point out some of the critiques of of what they've done. Because, I mean, I've seen a lot of discourse online, people for and against it. And I'm kind of curious if you're for and against, you maybe leave a comment below, um, and let me know. By the way, before we continue, almost forgot the intro. As usual, this live stream. Feel free to drop your questions below in the chat. And if you have any topics you want to discuss in the future, don't forget to like, subscribe, turn your notifications on. YouTube algorithm is a bit finicky, so like and subscribe. But basically, um, back to what I was saying about interest rates. So interest rates are typically it's a tool used to control inflation and GDP, or to attempt to control inflation in GDP. It's one of the tools the Bank of Canada has among many others, and we'll get to quantitative easing as I mentioned before. But essentially, the important thing to point out here. So that when they lowered their interest rates, um, typically, the Bank of Canada will lower interest rates when they want to spurt a little bit of a GDP growth. They want to increase the GDP growth. Um, it's important because, I mean, on the one hand, you can look at it as, we've had a bit of GDP growth that's kind of slowed. We've seen about the last figure I saw was 7.1% unemployment in Canada. And that's actually where my criticism to this decision will come. I mean, if they weren't going to raise interest rates, they should have just left it as is. I think I even saw someone write that in an article this morning, and I kind of laughed and said, yeah, that's exactly what they probably should have done. They probably should have left it. It was sitting at, what was the interest? What was the, let me just look it up quickly. What was it? There's a chart. Go on the Bank of Canada website. They have, 1 second, Canada interest rate. Yeah, they typically have Bank of Canada interest rate cut. Here we go. Well, policy interest rate. If you just Google policy interest rate Bank of Canada, you'll get a site, and basically they have a chart. So it's now 2.5. It was sitting at 2.75, and the last time what I wanted to get was it was at 3% while back. Now, something that's interesting about that is typically, I mean, if the interest rates are stable, there's not really much you can say about that. I mean, you can just say that maybe that's a hint that the government of Canada, they have a target, they have an overnight target they reach. So typically in Canada, it's between I believe it's 2 and 3%. Correct me if I'm wrong. 2 and 3% is the operating band. They want to keep interest rates between there, and that also goes in tandem with inflation. They want to control inflation. So if they're able to keep interest rates reasonably within that range, it means that inflation it means that they have that they have the inflation. I mean, it should theoretically mean that they're controlling inflation. And what's kind of interesting about this is, a lot of the arguments that this goes into the heart of Keynesian theory, Keynesian economic theory. So John Maynard Keynes was an economist, and he essentially came up with this framework, which has been around in North America since the 1930s, the Great Depression era, which was basically the government needs to bail out and pump money into the economy to to spur economic growth when there's lagging economic growth. So, like, let's say there's a depression, and basically what happened was in the 1930s, uh, when this was introduced, it essentially created a system that we have now, where you have larger financial institutions that again are that again the too big to it goes into the too big to fail, and that's one of the big criticisms. The government will always bail them out because to have one of the big six or one of the large financial asset management firms to kind of just collapse out of nowhere, it would just basically utterly destroy or ripple the market, basically ripple through the market globally, because a lot of these are hold global investments. And where am I going with the interest rates on this is where I'm going with the interest rates on this is if interest rates are stable, it means there's they have it under control theoretically. But if they raise interest rates, it means the government's spending too much money. So the Bank of Canada will raise interest rates, and that will rein in government spending. Borrowing becomes more expensive, mortgages become more expensive, and that's for a while we saw high interest rates. After COVID, the COVID era, we can say like 2020 was a record low interest rates. We hadn't seen that in decades. And now we would not, and then now we just shot, and people were complaining after, the interest rates just shot up. Borrowing mortgages, borrowing, the once in a lifetime, once in a generation opportunity to buy a home basically disappeared right after the recession and COVID, because they just raised interest rates, and that's what happened. They spent so much money over COVID. But now what's happening, and where I'm getting, and where I'm going to segue into now is Mark Carney has uh, Prime Minister of Canada. For those of you if you're not from Canada, he essentially has been talking about building. There's talking. We spoke about this in the last live stream. There's a $25 billion LNG project. And hold on, let me plug my laptop in. And anyways, sorry. Let me plug it in. Anyways, and I don't know if you can see me still. Yeah, and what's interesting about this whole dynamic um, is when you're spending that much money, and again, we're already seeing record high unemployment. Now, theoretically, I guess the logic that the government is using here is the logic that the government basically uses is theoretically, if if they spend, let's say they start building infrastructure in Canada. They want to build LNG, they want to build pipelines, they want to build one of the other projects they were talking about was an SMR power grid. They're also talking about copper mines. Is it copper and zinc mines Ontario, BC? I think it was one is BC. I'm blanking on the province where the other one was, but essentially that this is going to create jobs for the local communities. And of course, in Canada, you have all the other stuff, the other regulatory stuff. You also have to deal with the Indigenous relations. You also have to worry about environmental. We have a lot of environmental regulation here, and there's a lot of red tape you got to go to. That's another critique too. It's all said and done that they're going to spend money, create jobs, but it's like, just for those of you that read like Milton Friedman or Adam Smith, for something to have truly an economic benefit, you got to benefit from it before it drags on. So in other words, it's like you're a startup and you have a set budget. You have to be basically make sure your net cash flow positive before you run out of money. Otherwise, you're screwed, literally. So economically, I mean, speaking. So that's, I guess, one of the criticisms you could make on that. Then again, it is easy to criticize, but at the same time, this a lot of this stuff a lot of this becomes almost politicized and almost bureaucratic in the sense that, again, can't remember if I said this on an earlier podcast as well, but there was I was at the Global Energy Show and or sorry, no, that PDAC, Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada, at a convention every year, Toronto, and a guy I was speaking to a junior mining CFO, and he was telling me that it's like takes him like 7 or 8 years or something. I think he said the figure was like 7 or 8 years on average to essentially get to get through the bureaucracy just to put a shovel in the ground for a mine. And that's a major. So it's like when you talk about, oh, it's all nice said and done. You're going to create jobs. You're going to create infrastructure. And you're going to urbanize an area because they're going to have a lot of people moving, maybe a lot of people moving in, and that's going to create a bit of a. And again, if you're not producing, and again, in mines as well, though, for those of you that if you understand like mining, like you can go through you can if once you find a mine, like the mine is only so good for so many years. I mean, that's a whole other issue that for another stream, but that's something else. But back to the economic side of it, I think that the so I want to mention quantitative easing. So essentially, the government issues debt to alleviate some of the pressure in the economy. We saw this after the 2008 mortgage-backed security crisis. Uh, they haven't done that yet. We haven't had something that severe that's needed that. So, I mean, government still issues debt, but I mean, we're not at that point where the government's gonna go hard on a quantitative easing. I don't think we're not at that point, but I do think that that's another like Keynesian policy. That's almost like it doesn't make sense in the sense that there's a lot of it's like you don't become homeless. There's an expression I once heard. I kind of think it's a parallel to this. It's like you don't become homeless. You go through a period of stages before you become like homeless. That's another long story, but like what I mean, like you come to a realization, and then you might default on your property, so they'll give you a 3-month notice, and then this, and what I mean. There's all these steps you got to go through. So if you kind of think about it, if you kind of think about it in terms of, you kind of think about it in terms of, 1 second, video. Oh, shit. 1 second. I hear there's no video. Let me check. There is. There's a video stream. Anyways, that's that. 1 second. Hold on. There's video. There is video. That's the old one. That's the old one.
Okay.
Old one.
So this is the one. Okay, perfect.
Anyways, sorry. Anyways, sorry. It's a bit of an issue. Someone told me that someone texted me, and then there's no video, so I had to double check that. But yeah. So there's a bit of an issue with back to quantitative easing. I was saying was, there's a lot of steps that you get to before you get there. So I don't think that's necessarily. I mean, there's. Yeah, I don't think that's necessarily the move. And again, this goes to the heart of like, but I'll get to my point of this is I think there's a lot of people look at Keynesian theory as a be end all. Like the Bank of Canada, even the U.S. is notorious for this historically. Is like almost U.S. to a lesser degree. I think you're seeing Keynesian theory more in a lot of these socialized countries in Europe. Um, but I mean, if you go to like a strict like Adam Smith, Schumpeterian, like Joseph Schumpeter was like almost like the opposite of Schumpeter in the sense that, sorry, Joseph Schumpeter was the opposite of John Maynard Keynes in the sense that he almost preached like a like pure capitalist society. And I think there's a balance. You need government, but but you also need to preserve free market and let things play out. They say natural selection, and I think that's kind of maybe that's kind of like a sidebar that's not necessarily directly tied in, but I think it's important to kind of know that that people kind of put Keynesian theory on a pedestal, but they don't acknowledge that you know a lot of this will cause inflation. And where I'm getting at with the inflation, why inflation such a why inflating the economy for these multi-billion-dollar contracts that the government now wants to enter into amid all this is, yes, it might solve short-term unemployment, and yes, it might it might kind of stop the stagflation or the stunt in GDP growth that we're kind of seeing play out here. But at the long term, it's not really help. It's kind of like putting a band-aid. Those of you that are interested, I look me up on LinkedIn. I posted an article talking a bit about this actually, but it's kind of like it's almost like putting a band-aid on the issue. It's not. It's a short-term fix. It's not a long-term fix. I think the long-term fix in all this is 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 fix the unemployment rate. And the unemployment rate, 7.1% is crazy. It's the highest it's been since COVID. And I think an element of why the unemployment rate is so high. I mean, we can get into immigration politics, we can get into all these other things, and a lot of people talk about that. But one factor that I think a lot of people I never hear people talk about, or I haven't personally heard people talk about, is I mean, maybe I've heard it mentioned very few times, um, and even then it was kind of downplayed, and people tend to blame it on other factors. But it's because it's because companies are passing down the cost. They're not going to absorb. Companies don't want to absorb the more higher expenses. And so what happens is companies and they're not going to want to pay what they're going to do is instead of paying you more because for them they probably see it as cheaper. It's like I saw an article in the National Post. It said that RBC had a record high earnings this last quarter, but they also laid off a bunch of people, and that goes to the heart of the problem. Firms aren't going to just pay people more. They're more likely to just fire a bunch of people and increase the workload for some, or even automate. That's what AI is making this notoriously easy for these companies to just get away with this now. And this is I think this is that's another maybe that's another topic for next week. Maybe actually AI and the impact on unemployment, but there's gonna be I think we're gonna there needs to be a lot more of a fix. It's like I was listening to CTV News, and they were talking about how I think the fix with unemployment maybe one of the fixes with unemployment is the government. We've been has funded a lot. We have a lot of publicly funded universities in Canada. But I mean, but I mean, you don't really hear, and most people talk about study. I'm gonna go study the arts, study psychology, study science, study math. No one talks about really studying the trades, and you know that a lot of and so maybe that's a solution. Pushing people more into trades, getting more people into trades will solve a lot of solutions because that's something that will never go. But even then, that will eventually also saturate the market. So you're always going to have this issue. And again, the long-term fix is to keep is if the GDP is growing at a reasonable rate, and you're not and the government's not oversaturating over pumping the market up, essentially over propping the market, then inflation is not going to be as inflation could come down. We're likely where we could see inflation come down, and then if inflation comes down, companies are less likely to fire or have to work with the issue of having no what is it called? Work with or less likely to work with the issue of having no what's the word I'm looking for? Um, not as likely. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm blanking on my English. Um, they're less likely to fire people, or they're less likely to have to push. Sorry, yes, to push it down onto the consumer, or to push it down onto the employees. And that's also the thing too. Like I saw on LinkedIn earlier today, someone made the comment. In the take a picture of a Big Mac from the 1980s, take a picture of a Big Mac now, and I had commented on actually like the Big Mac analogy, which is the average cost of a Big Mac can be a sign of the health. Like the change in the price of Big Mac in the 80s, the burgers you would get at McDonald's were like 80 cents, 90 cents, and they were like I don't know, like like a quarter of the size larger than what they are now. Like they're much bigger than they are now. Now they got smaller and more expensive. So it's that again, that just shows that like companies are not gonna just be generous. So again, these are businesses that want to turn a profit. And so that's where I think the clash between the private and the public sector comes in is Keynesian theory, Keynesian economics works in theory, but when it comes to free market economy and you start dealing with the private sector, I think there's a lot of disconnect with what people with what policymakers in Ottawa think versus and have on paper and have written on paper versus what actually plays out in the market and the impact it has on Canadians. Anyways, might be a bit of slightly shorter live stream this week. If you hope you enjoyed the live stream. If don't forget to leave a comment below if you have any questions or correct or any if you want to fact check me or debate me on something. Leave a comment below. I'll address it, and maybe we'll even do like a live stream addressing those questions if you do. But don't forget to like, subscribe, turn your notifications on so you never miss an episode. Tune in on Mondays to the Commodity Bro podcast and follow us. We post shorts weekly.